So today we're going to talk about control of the heart rate. Now, your heart is said to be myogenic. What that means is it initiates its own heartbeat, its own innervation, its own nerve impulses. And they originate in the sinoatrial node, which is also referred to as the pacemaker. And that rate is somewhere between 60 and 80 beats per minute. So that sinoatrial node sends that wave of excitation through the walls of the atria to the atrioventricular node. That goes down the Purkinje fibres, Purkinje fibres, and then you get that contraction from the bottom of the ventricles. Now there are times when you want to change the rate. So you want it to increase or you want it to decrease. Now this is a negative feedback loop, and it's detected and coordinated by your medulla oblongata, the cardiac centre in your medulla oblongata in the brain. Now the pathway for this nerve impulse is the same every single time. It's always the same. It's the same as you did at GCSE. So you start with a stimulus. The stimulus is detected by a receptor. The receptor sends that nerve impulse to your coordinator. That does whatever it needs to do, sends nerve impulses to effectors. Remember, they're kind of muscles or glands, and then you get a response. Now we know what the response is. The response is that your heart rate either decreases or increases. We know what the coordinator is. The coordinator is your medulla oblongata. Now, the stimulus and the receptors can change. There are various things that your heart rate will increase or decrease in response to. Now, one of those things is a change in blood pressure. Now, if your blood pressure is too low, you can pass out, and obviously the oxygen, the glucose isn't getting to your cells quickly enough. So if your blood pressure is too low, you want to increase your heart rate to get more blood pumping round. If your blood pressure is too high, you can start to burst capillaries. It's like having a whole bunch of water through a river. It bursts its banks, which we've seen lately. So your blood pressure needs to be regulated. Now that is detected by baroreceptors or baroreceptors. Okay, so they detect pressure changes. If you have a barometer at home, it detects pressure changes. One of the other things that your medulla oblongata responds to is movement. So contractions of the muscles, and they are detected by stretch receptors. Now if you think about it, if you're detecting stretch in your muscles, that means your muscles are probably working, they're contracting. And if you're going to start to move more, you're going to want to increase your heart rate to deliver that oxygen and that glucose for that movement. If you're moving less, then your heart rate can come back down to normal. Okay? So they're detected by stretch receptors. And then you've got chemoreceptors. And chemoreceptors can detect pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen levels. Now, they kind of go together. So if you are respiring a lot and producing a lot of carbon dioxide, it's going to lower the pH of the blood. That's going to start to affect your enzymes. So if you've got a lot of carbon dioxide, your pH drops. You're going to want to increase your heart rate to get rid of that carbon dioxide and to bring your pH back to normal. If you've got less oxygen, more carbon dioxide, obviously it's going to address that, it's going to deliver that more of that blood, so your stroke volume is going to increase. If your heart rate increases, it's chucking more blood out kind of per minute, so you're going to be delivering more oxygen and glucose. So they are your stimuli, and they are your receptors. Now the one thing we haven't talked about yet is this pathway from your coordinator to your effector. Now there are two different pathways. There's what's called the sympathetic, can't spell, or your parasympathetic. So two lines going here. One could be sympathetic, one could be parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic is called the accelerator nerve. The parasympathetic, you can call it the decelerator nerve or the vagus nerve. Now, you've got to remember which one is which. The sympathetic leads to a rise in heart rate. So your heart rate is going to go up. Sympathetic, I mean, if you think about, in terms of nerves, if you stimulate a nerve, you get a nerve impulse and you get a response. And it doesn't matter if it's going up or down. But if you think about how we tend to use the word stimulate just in everyday life, if you stimulate somebody or you stimulate them to do something, generally you kind of increase their activity level, you get them to do something. So in that kind of sense, you can think of the sympathetic as kind of stimulating. You get a rise. But remember, any nerve impulse, it can decrease or increase that. You're still stimulating the nerve. So anyway, so your sympathetic is your accelerator nerve and you get a rise. So if your coordinator detects that your blood pressure is low, it's going to want to increase your heart rate. So it sends the response down the sympathetic nerve, and the sympathetic nerve goes to the effector, and the effector in all of these is the sinoatrial node, and it will stimulate the sinoatrial node to increase the heart rate, and so your response is that your heart rate will go up. If your blood pressure is too high, your medulla oblongata will receive those impulses, and it will send the nerve impulse down the parasympathetic to the sinoatrial node to decrease your heart rate. Okay? So the parasympathetic I think of as being for peace. It's bringing things back down, it's calming things back down to that normal 60 to 80 beats per minute. Okay? So let's have another look at another one. Muscle movement. If you're starting to increase your muscle movement, then your medulla oblongata is going to think, right, okay, we need an increase in heart rate, so that's going to go down your sympathetic nerve, it's going to go to your sinoatrial node, and it's going to increase your heart rate. When you stop exercising, that heart rate is going to need to come back down to normal. You don't need that elevated heart rate anymore. So that's going to go down the parasympathetic nerve to the sinoatrial node to bring that back down to that 60 to 80 beats per minute. Now, you may have noticed that both of these are going to the sinoatrial node. So what is different? What makes the sinoatrial node increase when it's stimulated by the sympathetic or decrease by the parasympathetic? Now, you may remember at the end of nerves, we did this at GCSE, we drew something a little bit like that, and you had vesicles containing neurotransmitter, and they would fuse with the membrane and release their neurotransmitter. And then that neurotransmitter will bind to receptors on the surface of cells and stimulate a response within those cells. So this sinoatrial node must be able to respond to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the difference between these two is which neurotransmitter they release. So the sympathetic releases a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. Now, noradrenaline is very similar to adrenaline, and you know adrenaline heightens things, it increases things, it's used in our fight or flight. So noradrenaline, when it binds to receptors on the sinoatrial node cells, will stimulate an increase in heart rate. The parasympathetic releases acetylcholine. So when acetylcholine binds to the receptors on these cells, it will lead to a decrease in your heart rate. So that's what the difference is. You've got two different nerves leaving your coordinator, going to your sinoatrial node, and they have two different neurotransmitters, and that's how it can bring about a different response. Now, you may have noticed that this is very similar to something else that we talk about in that whole fight or flight, and that's adrenaline. Now, adrenaline can be released from the adrenal glands, travel in the blood, and it will also stimulate the cells of your sinoatrial node to increase your heart rate. So noradrenaline is the neurotransmitter, adrenaline is the hormone, but they have a similar response. They increase, they elevate the heart rate. whether you are increasing or decreasing is down to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And what you need to do really is just to try and figure out which of these it needs to be, depending on what your stimulus is. So if you've got a high blood pressure, a lower blood pressure, you're going to want to decrease or increase your heart rate. So sympathetic, you're going to rise. Parasympathetic is for peace, it's for calming.